Hello everyone, thank you for joining me on this presentation. Special thank you to the MUHS for kindly inviting me to deliver this talk as part of their online mini-lecture series. I am Vanessa Buhagiar. I'm reading for an MA in Early Modern History at King's College London, and I'm here to talk about the paleographic perspective on the Kantilena. In this presentation, we will first look at what the Kantilena is and why we are looking at it through a paleographic lens. I will briefly go into some key paleographic terms so that you familiarize yourself with the jargon that paleographers use, and we will then apply this to the study of the Kantilena. So we will be describing the hand used to transcribe the poem and compare it to two manuscripts from the 16th and 14th centuries respectively. In this way, we are hoping that we learn more about Brandanus' handwriting as he applied it to the Kantilena, as well as its broader Central Mediterranean context. This will be very much a preliminary study, meaning that it is limited in the conclusions it can draw, but important nevertheless, given that no studies on the paleography of Maltese documents have been made thus far. The Kantilena is found in the last folios of Notary Brandanus de Cachar's first notarial register. In the introduction he pens to the Kantilena, Brandanus says that the poem was written by his ancestor Petrus de Cacharo. The poem was discovered in 1963 by Mikkel Vsadny and Gottfried Wattinger, and has to date been the eldest poem found written in Maltese, for which reason it is of high importance. The poem has been linked to the Renaissance humanist movement and is the only known literary output in Malta of this exact movement. The Kantilena is a poem that uses the metaphor of a collapsed house to recount a failed experience of the narrator's life. He says that although he built his house in the right way, he misjudged the situation and so it collapsed. The poem ends on a positive note, however, as the narrator proposes to build a new house on a different site. Perhaps he'd have greater luck there. The style of writing that Petrus used in the Kantilena is called an allegory, as the house he describes could be symbolic of a relationship or some other aspect of his life. This style of writing has been likened to that of Dante and Petrarch, the two fathers of Renaissance humanism. Writing in the vernacular, so in the Maltese as opposed to Latin, or Italian as opposed to Latin, was another trait of Renaissance humanism, which the Kantilena, so to speak, obeyed. It is the only known piece of literature written in Maltese from this Renaissance period, and one ought to point out that the next piece of literature written in Maltese, incidentally also a poem, came around 200 years later, in the late 17th century, so there is quite a big gap. The Kantilena is thus of high importance to study with regards to the origins of the Maltese language. Another interesting fact to point out at this point is that the Kantilena was here being written in a Latin alphabet, which is not something we ought to take for granted given the language's Semitic origin. So here a Semitic language is effectively being applied in the context of Renaissance humanism, which is glorifying the ancient Roman past or the classical era. The Kantilena is obviously a very rich piece of literary work and of great historical importance for the understanding of the Maltese language, its society and culture during the 15th and 16th centuries. However, we also need to recognize that the Kantilena is very much a limited source, given that it is the only example of its sort we have from the spirit in Malta. That is why we really need to exhaust the Kantilena from all aspects, and one that has not been attempted so far is the paleographic approach. So what really is paleography? Why am I examining this poem through paleography? So paleography is the study of handwriting and asks questions like how, when, where, by whom, or for whom was a document first made. These questions can tell us a lot about the document itself, the writer, and to a certain extent about the context within which this written fabrication occurred. It is thus an extremely useful discipline and tool, especially in circumstances where there is a lack of primary evidence on a topic, such as is the case with Renaissance humanism in Malta. Strictly speaking, paleography is the study of ancient handwriting, but it is far more than just the study of chiseled inscription or papyrus, as one would be led to think. Rather than that restrictive definition, some paleographers like Bischoff and Derrellet have considered it as being a form of art. So, because when you are studying handwriting, you are really looking at the movements of the pen, the style of a letter, and a general impression of a hand. Petrucci, a foremost Italian paleographer, writes that paleography is a discipline that is concerned with script during its different historical phases, its application to different documentary contexts, the documentation itself that was produced, and the techniques that were used to write it. This gives us a more acute idea about what paleography really is all about. The discipline of paleography owes much to its beginnings and disagreements to Jean Mabillon, whose most important contribution to the discipline has been the classification system of scripts for identification purposes. So, in the same way one would speak of Gothic architecture or Renaissance art, for instance, one too would speak of Renaissance minuscule or Gothic textualis and cursiva in paleography. Just what characteristics classify these scripts has been one of the main bones of contention of this discipline, but we won't go much into that in this presentation. Instead, we will examine some key paleographic terms that we will be using in the analysis. So when we speak of ductus, we are really speaking about the number of strokes that are used to write a letter, their order and their direction. So in this slide, I have given you two examples from the first notarial register of from Brandanus, which is the lower one, so a notarial deed, and the Kantilena, which is above. And you can really see a difference in the writing here, and this is down to the ductus. So the speed of the writing, but also the level of pen lift and the degree of composure, with the upper one, the Kantilena, being more composed. The aspect, on the other hand, is the overall appearance of a script. So we're really talking about whether it is upright or slanting, tall and narrow, or short and wide. Really think about the ratio of a letter in this regard. The ascender, on the other hand, is an upward stroke extending above the headline. So it would be the line going upwards in the letter H, here marked in red. The descender, on the other hand, would be the downward stroke extending below the baseline. In this case, the line going down in the letter G, also marked in red. Now you may wonder what the baseline is. The baseline is oftentimes imaginary, but not necessarily so. It is the line on which all letters are written, and this is indicated here by this red line on the slide. Then we also make a distinction between cursive and book script that we ought to explain at this point. So the cursive script is a quicker style of writing that sees a reduction of pen lift. So here the letters are joined together in 1, 2, or 3 successive motions of the pen. That meaning that there is no pen lift, it is one successive motion. For my Maltese friends here, cursive would signify the MUHS style of writing. Book script, on the other hand, is an elevated script used in formal contexts like manuscript production, which is distinguished by pen lift and greater definition of letter forms. Scribes would learn for many years this type of writing, and it would be very much appreciated in the manuscript world. So, with these definitions in mind, let's turn to describe the Kantilena hand. So you might be wondering why I am referring to it as the Kantilena hand. When you examine the writing of Brandanus' first notarial register, you can make a distinction between how he wrote his notarial deeds and how he transcribed the Kantilena. The difference is essentially down to the ductus, so the speed and the number of strokes he used in his writing. In his transcription of the Kantilena, there is an attempt at a more composed writing, emulating perhaps a book script. You can see this difference in the two images I chose for this slide. On the one hand, we have Brandanus's notarial hand on the right, which is more compressed, more cursive, faster, with fewer letter form definition than the Kantilena hand, which is on the left. So you can say that the Kantilena hand has a composed ductus. Although it too is cursive, it employs greater pen lift than his notarial hand. This is down to the context of his writing, which has now become literary as opposed to notarial. There's a tension in his hand, so to say. So the aspect of his Kantilena hand is short and wide. His writing was generally upright. Slanting letter forms tended to be part of the style of the specific letter forms. So the slanting is not really part of his style of writing. It's more dependent on the letter form. One of the key features applicable to both his Kantilena and notarial hands was the use of flourishes. So these are wavy, decorative lines that, according to Seurat, exhibit the joyful exuberance of a craftsman who displayed both his control and his inventiveness. His flourishes were used as line extenders that allowed him to keep a uniform line length and therefore a rectangular writing layout. This can nicely be seen in the image of the Kantilena on the left. Now let's turn to letter forms, morphology. We should look at morphology so that we familiarize ourselves with how his letters were written in order to understand the subsequent comparative exercise that we would do better. On this slide, you may see the letters used in the Latin Maltese alphabet in his Kantilena transcription. I am saying Latin Maltese alphabet as there was no distinction in how he wrote the letters in both languages, which is an important observation to make in relation to the history of the Maltese language. In these examples, I'm also sourcing letters from both the Kantilena itself as well as its introduction that was written by Brandanus. So here we have an overview of the letter forms. You may notice that some letters are duplicate. I did this to show you that he had different styles, usually two, for each letter. So if we look at the start, we have a single compartment A. We have a B with a relatively straight ascender. Notice that a similar straight ascender is used in the second D. In that case, there's also a left-leaning one above it. There are also two versions of C, one being round and the other looking similar to an R with an angular flat top. There is quite a normal E, a cursive F, and then there are two versions of G, one being more angular and the other having a more curved ascender. We also have two names for the ascenders in G. So if it is not connected to the top part, as would be the first G, that would be called a tail. And when it was connected to the top part, then we would call it a lobe because it forms something that is closed as opposed to open. The H, on the other hand, is characterized by an arch going below the baseline and extending inwards in an exaggerated manner, so to say. The I is pictured here with a dot, but it also sometimes did not constitute a dot on top. The K also exhibits a straight ascender, as the same with letter L. M, N, and O are relatively uncomplicated in their form. P and Q also have very straight descenders, which tend not to be curved in any way. Then we encounter two versions of R. So the first one that you can see has a serif at the baseline. The serif is like a straight line, usually of a decorative purpose. The second R is usually in combination with letters like O. So the R would essentially hang on to the previous letter, that being O or another form of lobe. This type of R comes from the aurum abbreviation in Latin. Then we encounter two versions of S, a round, short, curved one, and a long, elongated one. This is quite normal in Latin paleography. Then we see a normal T. The U here stands for both U and V. There was no distinction. There tends to be no distinction being made between the two letter forms at this point in Brandanus's writing. The U has a distinct curve on the left side. With regards to X, Y, Z, these are all very curved letter forms. They are less frequently found in Latin, but surely in Maltese, so they definitely came in handy in their curved form. So let's now compare the Kantilena hand to other scripts. The first one being a copy of Machiavelli's Il Principe. This manuscript was chosen for this comparative purpose as it is contemporary to the times of Brandanus de Cacciaro. It is written in the vernacular Italian and was a popular 16th century text. The scribe of this manuscript is unknown, but he employs a humanistic cursive script. This script was the invention of Renaissance humanists. The humanistic minuscule, which would be the book script, so to speak, was modeled on the Caroline minuscule of the 9th to 12th centuries, but was mistakenly thought to be the script of the ancient Romans, as the literature of ancient Rome, so we would say Cicero, was transcribed during the Carolingian period, and those are the manuscripts that were available to the Renaissance humanists when they came to study these works. But in the course of the development of the humanistic minuscule, its cursive variant, the humanistic cursive, came into being, and it was very much popularized as it allowed for faster writing. The hand of this Il Principe copy can be described as short and wide, with more elongated ascenders and descenders. The ductus is similarly cursive, with instances of pen lift. This hand, however, has a rightward slanting tendency that is absent in Brandanus. It also employs flourishes to extend the line length. These, however, are more restrained in the Il Principe hand than they are in Brandanus. So similarities between this Il Principe hand and Brandanus's Kantilena hand would include the rounded elongated F as in infra and tafal. Notice, however, the more playful rendition of Brandanus as opposed to the more composed and restrained F in Il Principe, which, however, still is very much round and cursive. Another similarity includes the G with its angular descender, or also called tail, when unconnected, as in this example. Here we need to point out that the cursive round G pertains to the humanistic style, and this angular one did not appear that much, so it might be an influence from a previous script system, which we will be exploring in the next slide. We can also notice the similar use of a single compartment A by both scribes. This is also typical for humanistic cursive. We can also see a similar use in straight ascender D, as in delle and vidille. This is another humanistic influence. We must remember, however, that Brandanus did use the left slanting ascender in D, which did feature prominently in his work. So whilst these are significant similarities, we need to also outline that there were equally significant differences, one being the letter H. Brandanus writes this with an arch that is extended below the baseline and goes inwards in an exaggerated manner, as we have seen in the previous slide. The Il Principe hand conversely stops at the baseline, and although it seems to arch inwards, it is nowhere near the extent to which Brandanus's goes, and this can very clearly be seen in the words qualche and hayran. Another difference would be the letter R, which in Il Principe is written without a serif, as in grazia, as opposed to how Brandanus writes it in Garca or Hayran, with the serif at the bottom on the baseline. So these differences prompt us to examine Brandanus's Kantilena hand in the light of other, perhaps older scripts, as we had indicated, to understand to a greater extent the scribal context and perhaps origin of these different letter forms. For this purpose, a mid-14th century copy of Dante's Divina Commedia was chosen as a way to understand whether the distinct letter forms outlined in the previous slide were of an older script. Dante was one of the fathers of Renaissance humanism, together with Petrarch, but he wrote his Divina Commedia at a time when humanistic minuscule was not yet developed or thought about, really. The script used in this manuscript is a form of Gothic cursiva. This was popular in Europe in the 14th to 15th centuries and essentially employed Gothic textualis letter forms with a cursive ductus, in a similar way to how the humanistic cursive functioned, with that being a cursive version of the book script, the minuscule, humanistic minuscule. The Gothic continued to have a long history of usage in Europe. It even continued to be used at the times when humanistic script came about. So there were really two scripts existing concurrently in Europe at that time, which we need to keep in mind. It's not that the humanistic script wiped out Gothic. That is certainly not the case. Gothic remained popular in the German lands, but also in England and France. And humanistic script was very much popular in Italy, since that was its birthplace. The aspect of the hand that wrote the Divina Commedia is short and wide. The letter forms are generally upright, with some letter forms, such as the ascender of D, slanting to the left. Ductus is very much composed. For a Gothic script, this is a cursive hand, but it is characterized by a lot of pen lift when one compares it to the humanistic hands seen in the previous slides, as in the case of the Il Principe, for instance. The script is very much angular. It does not have the roundness of the humanistic script, and no flourishes are being employed by this hand. In the case of letter forms, an important similarity is the writing of the letter R with a serif underneath. As we have seen, Brandanus exclusively wrote in this letter form with the serif underneath. He would not have written it without a serif. The usage of the serif is not present in the humanistic script, but it very much is in the Gothic. So this might be a Gothic influence on Brandanus's handwriting. Another similarity constitutes the letter Z, which both of the scribes wrote with two compartments, resembling the number 3. The left-leaning letter D in Brandanus has already been described and can be seen in the De Nostra below. We can similarly point out differences, however, as the use of the long S in the middle of a word in the Gothic script, as seen in De Nostra as well. Although the long S does continue to be used in humanistic script when placed in the middle of a word, Brandanus had the tendency to use it mostly only when there was a double S. So in that case, he would write a round S, short round S followed by a long S. A single S occurring in the middle of the word, however, tended to be written in a round form, as is being shown in this example of the word muxule. So, having described Brandanus's hand and having compared it to humanistic cursive and Gothic cursiva hands, one can argue that, in a general sense, it bore greater similarities to the humanistic cursive of the copy of Machiavelli's Il Principe. The key factors in this case include the roundness of the letter forms, the cursive writing, and key letter forms like round F and the style of G. The similarities to the Gothic cursiva hand was, on the other hand, limited to letter forms like R with a serif and the left-leaning D. Whilst these similarities in morphology are certainly important, they are not enough to surpass the more complex similarities with humanistic cursive. So although one cannot really draw fixed conclusions from this limited analysis, as we pointed out in the introduction, one can point out certain impressions, namely that the Kantilena hand of Brandanus bore greater similarity to humanistic cursive hand than the Gothic cursiva. This preliminary study certainly leads to further questions, like how does Brandanus' notarial hand fare in comparison to humanistic or Gothic scripts? How does Brandanus' writing compare to other notaries? Is there such a thing as Maltese notarial script? On the other hand, we can also ask what this similarity to humanistic cursive or Gothic cursiva means. Does it suggest connectivity? How up-to-date were the Maltese islands to the scribal trends of Europe? Can we speak of a Maltese script in light of this at all? The questions are truly endless. This, however, demonstrates the ability of paleography to contribute to the study of Maltese history and documents and provide new perspectives to the re-examination of such documents. It is a very much exciting topic that certainly merits further exploration. Thank you for listening in to this presentation. I really hope it was interesting and that it made you excited about paleography. I wish to leave you with a brief bibliography on paleography. I have chosen books that are most generally accessible in university libraries or for purchase online. Please do get in touch with me if you have any queries about this presentation. Thank you.